Before we begin this episode, I want to give a small trigger warning. There will be some talk about suicide. If you or someone you love struggles with suicidal thoughts, please use these resources, or local resources to help. And now, on with the show. Hello, and welcome to the Riff Arcade spin-off show, Let's Playto. I'm your host, Butts, and on this show, I'll break down your favorite games to show you their social, historical, and philosophical themes. Now, I don't have a degree in any of those fields, but I hope you will be inspired to engage with these topics and games for yourself. This is a fan-made project, so any opinions that sneak through are mine and mine alone. So please, sit back, enjoy the episode, and be ready, because spoilers are incoming. Today, we deal in blood and darkness, with Supergiant's 2020 indie darling, Hades. You play as Zagreus, the son of Hades. You have just had it up to here with your dad, so you decide to leave and join your relatives on Mount Olympus. Dear old dad and his dear old dead army isn't going to make that easy. Hades is a roguelike, not to be confused with a roguelite or a roguelite. I want one. This means that every time you play, the rooms, layouts, powers, and enemies are randomized. Hades won just all of the awards when it was released, and it deserves them. It's a fabulous game. The art is amazing, the combat is perfectly balanced, the story is a joy to unfold, the soundtrack slaps. And on top of all that, it does something that I believe only the media of video games can accomplish. So let's see how Hades gets you, yes you, to realize that life is absurd. And that's okay. Albert Camus was born in Drian, Algiers in 1913. His father, who he never met, died shortly after his birth in World War I. His mother was a maid. Camus and his family occupied a section of society called Pied Noir, French for Blackfoot. These were poor, working-class people of French descent who'd lived in Algeria. Camus did not have much growing up, but he had three things going for him: his French citizenship, his intelligence, and a talent for soccer. He was accepted into a prestigious school in Algeria and was goalkeeper for their soccer team when they won the North Africa Cup in 1930. Unfortunately, Camus contracted tuberculosis that same year, ending his soccer ambitions. He moved in with an uncle and began to study philosophy and literature. His uncle was a butcher, so I'm sure he got some really good steaks too. He joined various communist leagues in Algeria and France, but never stayed a member for long. When World War II broke out, he moved to Paris and during the French occupation became the editor for a resistance paper called Combat. He was even searched for by the Gestapo. It was during the French occupation that Camus wrote his first cycle of works: a novel, an essay, and a play. All three works tied together by a central theme. Once the war was over, Camus traveled and spoke at universities, often speaking out against the continued colonization of his native Algeria. He completed a second novel, essay, play cycle in 1952, and in 1957, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature, becoming the second youngest Nobel laureate. He used his new status and fancy gold medal to decry capital punishment, Soviet policies, and Francisco Franco's regime in Spain. He was a lifelong pacifist, though he stayed neutral during the Algerian War. Camus continued to write and speak until his untimely death in a car accident in 1960. He had decided to ride with his publisher instead of taking the train. His unused train ticket was still in his pocket. Camus' life is fascinating. He was very stylish and handsome. He spoke highly of sports and competition. He championed simple pleasures in life, and the man could pull. Despite his success, the Parisian intelligentsia never really accepted Camus due to his Algerian origin. He was a Pied Noir after all. But his writing is focused, direct, and unique. And it is Camus' most famous essay, the theme of his first cycle of works that we're going to unpack: the absurd. So when us normies use the word absurd, we mean something crazy, something completely bonkers, ridiculously unreasonable, machine gun and ancient Greece type crazy. But when Albert Camus uses absurd, he's using it as a technical term. If I see a man armed with only a sword attack a group of machine guns, I shall consider his act to be absurd. But it is solely by virtue of the disproportion between his intention and the reality he will encounter, of the contradiction I notice between his true strength and the aim he has in view. Hey, machine guns again, right? Maybe machine guns are just absurd. For Camus, the absurd is the difference between how humans see and operate in the world versus how the world really is. Humans possess a sense of morality, but the universe is cold and uncaring. We possess rationality, but everything else in the universe is irrational. This world in itself is not reasonable. That is all that can be said. But what is absurd is the confrontation of this irrationale and the wild longing for clarity whose call echoes in the human heart. This gap, this distance with reality that human beings experience, is what Camus calls the absurd. The absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. There is another point to keep in mind when Camus is talking about the absurd. He thought that to ignore it, to distract yourself and refrain from thinking about it, was a cop-out. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Keeping it alive is, above all, contemplating it. Unlike Eurydice, the absurd dies only when we turn away from it. Hey, Eurydice, I know her. This is why Camus was against the first possible response to the absurd: suicide. Camus was very serious about this point. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. All the rest, whether or not the world has 3 dimensions, whether the mind has 9 or 12 categories, comes afterwards. To end it all, to reject the absurd and with it life itself, to refuse to be fooled by nature any longer, was not an option for Camus. To use a sports analogy that I'm sure Camus would enjoy, you can't just quit the team. The second response is to distract yourself with something, anything, that takes your mind off of it. Anything that turns off that doubting, reasoning part of your mind. This leads Camus to reject religion, as he thought that religion makes people focus on different realities and lose focus on this one. I personally disagree with him on this point, and here Camus parts ways with many of humanity's best and brightest, but just for the sake of taking Camus on his own terms, let's assume for the rest of this video that there is no afterlife. To turn away from confronting the absurd is not an option, any more than rejecting it is. You stay on the team, but only worry about your own personal stats or your contract extension. What I know, what is certain, what I cannot deny, what I cannot reject, this is what counts. I can negate everything of that part of me that lives on vague nostalgias, except this desire for unity, this longing to solve, this need for clarity and cohesion. I can refute everything in this world surrounding me that offends or enraptures me, except this chaos, this sovereign chance, and this divine equivalence which springs from anarchy. So if we shouldn't physically or mentally kill ourselves, what's left? The third option? Rebellion. This is the only option for Camus. The natural state of knowing that nothing in the world ultimately matters leads us to depression and nihilism. But if humans are an exception in nature, then we must not adopt the attitude nature seems to be pushing us towards. To abolish conscious revolt is to elude the problem. The theme of permanent revolution is thus carried into individual experience. Living is keeping the absurd alive. Camus believes that everything is ultimately meaningless, but he sees it as a positive. If nothing matters, then it doesn't matter if you enjoy something or not, so you might as well enjoy it. You play the game to win, even if you know that the score doesn't matter outside the stadium. Camus was a champion for simple, ordinary pleasures in life, something most philosophers gloss over or look down on. Think about it this way. When you drew a picture as a kid, the picture did not affect your life in the slightest. No one's life spiraled out of control because they drew crayon art as a 3-year-old. But at the time you drew it, you were having fun. You enjoyed it. Camus is just saying to expand that to all of existence. By acknowledging the absurd, choosing to make the things you do have meaning, and by enjoying those things, Camus says we can turn the absurd on its head and find fulfillment in life. Thus, I draw from the absurd 3 consequences, which are my revolt, my freedom, and my passion. By the mere act of consciousness, I transform into a rule of law what was an invitation to death, and I refuse suicide. Normally, this is the part where I ask how all this relates to Hades, but I think this goes much further than just Hades. This game so embodies the concept of the absurd that I think it shows us all what a unique medium of art video games can be. But seriously, how does this relate to Hades? Well, the initial plot of Hades is wanting to leave the underworld. Angsty teen, dad's a bummer, party on Olympus, say no more. Plus, I can't imagine it smells good down here. Even Elysium is probably bad for allergies. But after a few attempts, you learn that your mother is living just outside where you emerge, and from then on, seeing her becomes your prime motivation.
So, boy, did you ask her about how she came to join me in the underworld? Did you confirm all your suspicions then?
You struggle and fight, and then finally, you get out and meet her, only to die because you cannot live on the surface.
Zagreus?
Guess I'm just a little tired, that's all. Not accustomed to the weather, as I think you call it.
No, that isn't it. It's that you cannot stay here. You can't stay here.
Really, you're kicking me out? Why?
The fates are cruel, Zagreus. You're bound to that place. Same as your father. So they would have us say goodbye. For now. My heart soars knowing you live. Then it breaks that our time together was so brief.
No, I can come back. I can come back. Now that I found you, maybe he'll just let me come back.
You tell him I demand it. And I demand he also tell me how come he, or for that matter Nyx, never sent notice that you lived. Olympus is all rife with schemers. But I was so naive to think that they were different.
I'll tell him. I feel awful. I have to go.
The Styx shall take you then. Oh, Zagreus. Farewell, my son. Won't you come back to me? When you are able, please. Come back. I shall be waiting here. However long it takes.
However long it takes.
It's from this point onward that you are Camus' absurd. See, all the quotes I've pulled have been from Camus' most famous work, The Myth of Sisyphus. That would be this guy right here, the original CrossFitter. We've got an Inception situation here, people. I'm going to describe a myth that is used as an analogy in an essay that was the inspiration for a game that also contains the original myth. Confused? Yeah, me too, and I wrote it. Anyway, here's Playto, let's! the show in a show that teaches you what you need to know to understand the episode it's in. Sisyphus was the king of Corinth, who just kept dunking on the gods. He cheated death twice. The first time, death showed up to cart him to the underworld in chains, but Sisyphus tricked death to try on the chains himself, to make sure they were strong enough. He totally let death out, though. When he obviously didn't, and the world erupted into chaos because no one was dying anymore, Ares came down to free death. You know how much street cred you get for chaining up death? Later, Cephas convinced Hades, the guy, not the place, to let him out of Hades, the place, not the guy, to see his wife. He then played hooky for years. But if there's one thing Zeus hates more than consent, it's mortals tricking gods. Sisyphus was punished to roll a boulder up a hill. His torment would be over once the boulder was secure on top, but every time he got there, the boulder would roll right back down to the bottom.
You've really never gotten Baldy to the top before.
Never got the boulder to the top, not even once. Always tumbles down right at the very end. Lost count after the 19,000th time or so. But you know what? One of these days, I bet it's going to stick.
It was this futile punishment that Camus latched onto as a metaphor for the absurd. What better image to explain the absurd than that? Somebody putting in grueling, struggling effort in a task that is utterly meaningless and futile. And this is where it all comes back to the game. As I said earlier, there's a point in gameplay where you literally become Sisyphus. The game tells you you'll never escape the underworld. So from that moment on, every escape attempt thereafter is pointless. Nothing you do will get you one step closer to Olympus. But no one stops there. No one puts the game down when the game literally tells you you'll never beat it. You know it's pointless, and yet, guys, the gameplay, the story, it's all so good. It's a joy to play, even after knowing it's pointless. The game itself becomes the boulder, and we all happily push it up the hill. Here's where Hades, the game, not the guy or the place, really shines. See, in movies, you're just an observer. The movie just happens in front of you, no participation. In books, you're the visual director, but you can insert yourself into the story to some extent. But in games, you're the protagonist. It's happening to you. The narrative payoffs happen to you. That's what's unique about games, especially this one. You aren't just seeing or reading about the absurd, you're actively doing it. You know every run ends the same way.
How am I going to beat him?
But you happily jump right back in. Heck, or I guess Hades in this case. Hades! I would argue it's only after death that you get the reward for the game. That's when the character storylines open up. That's when you can think of new strategies, new power-up combos you can try, new weapon upgrades, new house decorations. Oh, lovely! Really brightens up the eternal gloom. There you are, standing at the bottom of the game's hill, and you cannot wait to start pushing that boulder up that hill. See, I could sit here trying to explain the absurd all day. Camus certainly did. But it's with Hades, the game, not the place or the guy. There are too many things named Hades. That you experience, act out, and become the absurd. Man, games are neat. The Myth of Sisyphus, the essay, not the myth, or not this problem again. The essay challenges us to face the fact that life is and will never be what we think it should be. To really face it. Not to distract ourselves or to make it out to not be so bad or just to quit entirely, but to stare life squarely in the face. But I don't think Camus meant that we can't do anything to try to fix life. He loved sports and teamwork. Self-improvement and camaraderie all appealed to Camus. We should do everything we can to bridge that gap between how it is and how it ought to be. We aren't just observers, we are agents. Life isn't a movie to watch, it's a game to play. You play to win the game. And even if you know for a fact that you can't ever fully win, it's the playing it well that's the important part. I leave Sisyphus at the foot of the mountain. One always finds one's burdens again. But Sisyphus teaches the higher fidelity that negates the gods and raises rocks. He too concludes that all is well. This universe henceforth without a master seems to him neither sterile nor futile. Each atom of that stone, each mineral flake of that night-filled mountain, in itself forms a world. The struggle itself toward the heights is enough to fill a man's heart. One must imagine Sisyphus happy.